Okay, well, we might as well begin now. Um, we have our distinguished panel assembled here, and I know that we have an audience here of distinguished guests, and I saw on camera we have Premier Roy Romano in Saskatoon and John Courtney and others, so there's a lot of people with a lot of interest in this issue, so I think it's going to be a fun hour and a half. So let me begin. Thanks for joining us here at this election panel. We do one of these after every election in Saskatchewan or Canada, and we bring in a group of people that have a tremendous amount of interest and experience in this issue to talk about it. Let me first of all say that, welcome from the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. We're the provincial center for advanced study and research in public policy administration. And of course, this is a partnership between the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina. And Saskatchewan is known for its innovation, and the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School is another example of Saskatchewan being an innovator in Canada. I'd like to further take a moment to acknowledge that today's event is taking place on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 land and the traditional homeland of the Métis. I'm Ken Rasmussen. I'm the director here at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School in Regina. If I could get maybe somebody, if you could turn your mics off at the U of S, that would be helpful because they kind of make a little bit of noise. Thank you. So I'll be your moderator for this event today, and just want to welcome everybody here to this event. Now, we're extremely pleased to have this group of panelists with us today. I mean, it's a veritable who's who of politics and government activity in this province. So I'm going to introduce a panelist briefly because we only have an hour and a half, and I know that people are itching to get going on this topic. We had a bit of a preview yesterday, and everybody's filled with lots of ideas and insights about what this election means. And we're going to have them offer their comments. But first of all, I just want to introduce Lolene Bertel, who's the professor and head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Saskatchewan. She has a PhD from the University of Calgary. She used to work at the Canada West Foundation, is an exceptional teacher, and is the author of a new book on getting the most out of your PhD with Jonathan Malloy, a really great book. So she's an outstanding scholar and teacher, and as I said, head of political science. We also have the head of the political science department at the University of Regina here. This may be a rarity, having them both here. Jim Farney, whose interests are in Canadian political parties, political institutions. He's the author of a book called Social Conservatism and Party Politics in Canada and the United States, and Conservatism in Canada. Kevin Doherty is here. Of course, most everybody in this room is familiar with Kevin. He's the former Minister of Finance in the province of Saskatchewan, MLA for Regina Northeast, and served in cabinet in a variety of other aspects. He's held several board positions, including the University of Saskatchewan's Board of Governors, Vice Chair of the Hospital of Regina Foundation, member of the Regina Chamber of Commerce, and so on. And so he's got a plethora of experience to provide here, and we're really delighted that he's agreed to be here. Joe Garcia is here, a colleague of mine since we were graduate students at the University of Manitoba. He's a professor at political studies at the University of Saskatchewan, where he teaches and does research on public policy management, and is a well-known commentator on Saskatchewan politics and public policy. Sally Hauser has a variety of communication positions for the NDP, both federally and provincially. She was the press secretary for Jack Layton in the 2011 War Room, and she served as national director of the federal NDP party during the 2012 leadership race. She's had a number of jobs across, including, what struck me as very interesting, she worked at the High Commission in Ottawa for a number of years before returning to Canada. Well done. That sounds very cool. And finally, Charles Smith, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at St. Thomas More at the University of Saskatchewan, very interested in the labor movement, federal-provincial policy, most recently honored authored Unions in Court, Organized Labor, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and is very interested in Saskatchewan politics as well. So, with that introduction to this group, I'm going to start in Saskatoon, and we're going to rotate back and forth. And so we're going to have Lolene start by just offering everybody's going to offer a few general observations about yesterday or Monday's election and some of the repercussions from that. So Lolene, if you want to start. Want to hit your button?
I'm going to turn the mic on. Try that again. Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you everyone for coming. I don't know if anyone has reached the point of post-election fatigue yet, but Ken said the election yesterday, and it does feel like yesterday because for everyone here, and certainly with Jim Farney as well, we've been talking about this election a lot because there's a lot of things to discuss. So we've decided to split what we're talking about so we don't all say the same thing. What I'm going to talk about is the idea of an electoral mandate and whether or not there is a mandate that's coming out of this election. So there's a very well-known series of books about Canadian politics called Absent Mandate, and it's this idea that governments in Canada don't have mandates. Governments in Canada, elected governments in Canada, like to claim mandates, and we saw this even from Mr. Trudeau when he won a minority government, but acted like he won a majority government. Speech, he very much is proclaiming that he has a mandate, and what is that mandate if it does exist? I would argue that there actually is a mandate that's coming out of this election, but it might not be one that everyone sees. I don't know that the mandate is for the government so much as it's a mandate for the House of Commons. And what we saw in this election was we saw over half of the voters in Canada that chose to vote for political parties that are supportive of climate action and specifically for the carbon tax. We also saw over half of Canadian voters vote for political parties that are in favor of a pipeline and advancing the energy industry. To me, I put those together and I say, well, and those were the dominant issues, if there were dominant issues in this campaign. Those were the dominant policy issues. And to me, that tells me that this House of Commons and government, by extension, have a mandate to reconcile these two very difficult issues. It's a challenging issue to advance the economy and to advance the environment, but that is what people want. My background is in polling research, and when people are asked what they prioritize, the economy or the environment, they consistently say, I want both. And it's reasonable to want both. We should want both. And we should demand from our politicians that they find solutions to give us both. Now, that's not what was on offer to us. Politicians in the election very much seemed to pit them against each other, but that's not where Canadians fell. And so I would argue that there was a mandate coming out of this election to find solutions to the things that matter to Canadians and to find ways to compromise to have these achieved. In the aftermath of the election, I'm not seeing rhetoric at the federal or provincial level yet that speaks to that willingness to compromise, but I'd say that is what I took from the election. Ken, am I in my 5 minutes?
Yes, you are. That's perfect. Thank you very much. I'll turn to Jim now. Jim Farney from Regina.
Okay, and this is working great. So my kind of provocative little bit is I've got kind of two areas I'll raise as things I saw on election night as interesting. One is about what it tells us about Canadian conservatism, and then one is what sort of historical analogy we should be thinking about in this kind of highly regionalized election situation afterwards. The Canadian conservatism bit is obviously there isn't a Liberal between Winnipeg and Vancouver. So good night for the Tories that way. But if you looked at the 905, where they'd broken through in 2011 and formed government on, that went red. And Lisa Raitt was the most notable victim of that. They also didn't make a serious breakthrough into rural Quebec, which is where they'd hoped to pick up a lot more seats than they did. You can cut this all sorts of different ways, and I'm sure that the Tory war room is this morning or this week. But to me, there is an interesting question about whether they've run out of a generational plan. Tom Flanagan, who was Harper's first chief of staff, talked about how they changed their strategy from trying to win these massive Mulrooney or Diefenbaker style landslides to a strategy where they would mobilize their base, form a minimum winning coalition, and so just win enough seats to form government, but it would be a coherent group of people. It would be Western Canada, rural Ontario, and suburban parts of Toronto, and then the party wouldn't blow up. And in a sense, I think they were successful with that in 15. People's Party aside, the party lost and didn't blow up. But it looks this election, and it looked last election, like that might not be enough to win. And I think in terms of watching how Scheer picked up people, there was no pickup this campaign for him. And so there's a deep rethink, I think, of how to appeal to suburban people, how to appeal to a swing vote that went their way in 2011, women between 35 and 45. I didn't see much this time to move those demographics. The second thing I want to think about is really what happened after the election. Mr. Moe's comments yesterday and the growth, if anybody's on social media, of Wexit, which just kind of blew up on Facebook. It went from like 0 people Monday night to 80,000 people last time I checked. And are we back in the 1980s in Western Canada again in terms of Western alienation? And the reason I want to raise that question is we had the farm crisis in the 80s that caused huge dislocation in rural Alberta and Saskatchewan. We had an oil crash. We had a lot of economic dislocation. And we turned to regionalism and a set of political meta-constitutional efforts to resolve it. None of that came to much. And I worry a little bit that we're headed down that direction again, where we see the answers to these big economic challenges in terms of reopening the equalization formula, which is a mess, and I don't claim to understand it. And I'm not sure that that's going to get us to solutions that actually help people who got laid off by Husky yesterday. I'm not quite sure how to balance all that off yet, but it's certainly something I'm curious in talking about.
Good, thanks, Jim. We'll just rotate back to Saskatoon now and just follow the seating arrangement there.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think my comments underscore and segue with some of the points that were already made. I'm just going to make a few quick points. Number one, in terms of the provincial premiers here, they've got to decide whether they want policy change or regime change. And if they want policy change, they're going to have to make some choices about which policies they want changed. By regime change, I mean they're basically asking the Liberal government to do all the heavy lifting. And they have 3 major demands. And the fourth demand is, when you're done doing all that heavy lifting, we have a fourth one, and that's get out of the way and let Scheer govern. That's not a kind of a very good offer, I think, for the Liberals. So they're going to be strategic. And so what we've got in terms of policy change, as was implied, is you're trying to change policy, in essence, complex matrices of policies. It's like 3-level chess and trying to play 3-level chess in a tornado. And there's political forces, economic forces. There are internal pressures, external pressures, and you're trying to, position these pieces on the board. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a really major challenge. I think people forget about, a couple of things about public policy that make things challenging. Number one is it's multi-value choice. We're not only a divided country, we're a more complex kind of an electorate, a complex citizen. We have many demands, we have many interests, even within ourselves, not just between us. But I myself am a torn individual. I'm conflicted. We are conflicted. And to try and find the right ointment that, everybody can soothes everybody's feelings and pains is going to be a little bit difficult. And I'm going to do just a little bit of political science here as well. I'm sure many of you have heard of Theodore Lowy. You might remember his models of distributional versus redistributional policies. And I think one of the, and his basic thesis was that distributional politics are a lot easier to get consensus on than redistributive policies. Distributive policies is when you have unlimited resources, you have certain demands, and you basically give everyone whatever they need from some source. But redistributive policies is when you're actually seen to be taking from one and giving to another. And that creates incredibly conflicting, high conflict politics. And the high conflict politics, in my mind, are most paramount in two areas. And I think one is equalization. Even though we've tried to hide the fact that equalization is not necessarily redistribution, the new calculations that are being made by economists and the provincial governments in Alberta and Saskatchewan are saying when you actually do the extra calculations that we've never done before, we are putting more money into federation than we're getting out of it. So, the equalization gets caught in that. And so they're very angry that more money is going to other provinces than Alberta and Saskatchewan. And sorry, that must be me. I thought I turned it off. But I'm Italian. I like to do my lectures to music. Just one final point, and that is whether or not we can find a minister who's from the prairies. And I think there is one, but he's living in British Columbia. His name is Jonathan Wilkinson. He's the current Minister of Fisheries and Ocean. He's actually a Saskatchewan boy. He's a U of S graduate. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and he served in the Romano government. He served in the provincial civil service. He's got a greater legitimate claim to being of Saskatchewan for Saskatchewan than Mr. Scheer does. So I think the Liberals are probably going to use him. And it'll be, that's my prediction, and I'm looking for it. He's actually in North Vancouver, representing North Vancouver, essentially where the pipeline head ends. And he might be the person who understands sort of the full spectrum of issues, including Aboriginal issues. So he's one to keep our eyes on.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll hold you to that speculation. Sally, we'll start. We'll just go through down the aisle. Sally?
Sure. Thanks very much. So I guess just an overall, takeaways from it. One, what I found was interesting is that, and I've actually written op-eds before about, cheap polling these days and the detriment to kind of our conversation. Journalists or really news agencies now tend to use polling a lot to cover a horse race that they no longer have the journalists being paid to cover in the newsroom, and cheap polling produces cheap results. However, in this election, a lot of the polling kind of really bore out on election night. Yes, there was variances, but there was a bit of a redemption for the pollsters, I think, in this campaign. The second kind of more data-driven issue that was less of a winner was, I've been told for ages, and the Conservatives have bragged about it, I know some of the people who've worked on that Conservative campaign, is that micro-targeting, that the digital campaigning that was really supposed to drive them. They're saying that the polls aren't picking up. And that goes a little bit to your point, Jim, about the compartmentalizing. That failed them in this campaign. And I know from talking to some Conservatives who were not in the campaign and also were in the campaign, that was, there was some conflict about that throughout the course of the campaign. And certainly some people that are not super happy with that real focus on the micro-targeting and the digital aspect of it. The second thing to note is, as the New Democrat on the campaign, even though I think the 25 seats that the NDP got across the country was certainly under what we had hoped for, you know, given the kind of wave or momentum, positive campaign that the NDP was running, I think it bodes well for the future. There was a real kind of positivity of the NDP campaign, and I think nobody would really argue with me that the other two were fairly negative. One might, you know, the Liberals might say the Conservatives were really negative, and vice versa. But I don't think you could really say that about the NDP campaign. And that seemed to really motivate younger voters. And even a lot of people, you know, when you saw the use of social media and TikTok and everything like that, people that couldn't necessarily vote in this campaign but that will be able to vote in the next campaign. So for the NDP, I think that's a real good takeaway for them. And then it's a matter of kind of building on that up until the next campaign, retaining those voters, retaining that excitement, getting people to join membership, and then moving on from there. And then, you know, another thing, I guess, a lot of the commentary I do, it's usually only me from the West and whoever else from Montreal or Toronto. So, you know, the one seat that was retained that didn't go blue in Alberta and Saskatchewan is Edmonton Strathcona in Alberta. That's Rachel Notley's home provincial seat, and the NDP had it for a while. So as much as it was an NDP seat, it was still really good to retain that, and should be a reminder that despite all the seats going blue, there were a lot of tight races across. You know, here in Saskatchewan, we're really largely, you know, with the exception of Ralph Goodale, it's the NDP versus Conservatives. And this is what I'm always trying to explain to my friends out east, is that this kind of liberal argument of, you know, you have to vote strategically, you know, for Liberals, if you don't want the Conservatives to get in, doesn't really bear out in the West or really anywhere outside of the urban centers, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto. There's a lot of these ridings around here where it's actually New Democrats who beat Conservatives. And I just say that because it bugs me, and I think it's something we should talk about more. Finally, you know, I was amazed at the Prime Minister's a lack of conciliatory tone on election night, despite being kind of the lefty here on the panel. I think you have to understand that there is a feeling of alienation, and it's real, whether you believe that the justification for feeling that is real or not. You have to understand that that is a real thing, and it's ultimately something that the Prime Minister is going to have to deal with moving forward.
Thanks, Sally. Charles.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you for all my distinguished panelists. To be on this distinguished panel was quite an honor. It's an honor to be here on Treaty 6 territory. I called this part of my talk, "Oh, How Far the Left Has Fallen," and I've never been accused of doing political science, Joe, so I'm hoping maybe you will. I mean, obviously, to look at the left in this election requires us to think broadly, not just of 2019, but what has happened to left politics, not just in Canada, but across the world. And, you know, what we've seen is, you know, the sort of broad political economy of neoliberalism and the broad declines of class-based politics has really been occurring in the Western world since the 1990s. So these trends are global, but the NDP as a party ostensibly was designed to protect the interests of workers and unions from the devastations brought on by unfettered capitalism. And I'm putting my notes that the party today certainly slipped, and I've added like run, walked, sprinted. I don't know, you could probably find other ways to describe it. From that original version or vision, successive leaders of the party from Layton to Mulcair and now Singh have tended to jettison many of these class-based politics that defined an earlier generation. But having said that, looking at the campaign and the defining issue of our times, and Aline touched on this as well, is that climate change, the party has been divided by regional power structures where the political economy of certain regions, and here we would talk about Saskatchewan and Alberta, really butts up against the regional power blocks in other regions of the country. So here I've looked at BC and Vancouver Island. So here's an example. While the NDP lost all of its seats in Saskatchewan, the 3, they held their seats in BC, or they lost a few, but on Vancouver Island, they virtually swept Vancouver Island, 4 seats, and the ones they did lose were the Greens. So how do you compare and contrast a political economy where you have to support oil, but on Vancouver Island, if you support oil, you're never going to win those seats, right? Like that's a power structure that is almost impossible to navigate. What you've said, Lolene, how you navigate that, it's really hard, especially for the left. And here's another example that best is exemplified by the endorsement. Well, not so much official endorsement, but they were in the media, the steelworkers who, and this is, I have in my notes, steelworkers, who are like been the backbone of the NDP for generations, are saying we're not going to vote NDP or endorse them, we're going to vote for the Conservatives. And that's unheard of, right, in left-wing politics in Canada. Steel has been a backbone of the social democratic movement in this country, and you've got steelworkers endorsing Conservatives in Saskatchewan because they're saying we want to build pipelines, and that's what our jobs do. So we hit a roadblock for the left, I think, here. And if it's going to have cachet, I think the left has to win support from working people. Hard to do in Western Canada when you're proposing what is the one economic question. Of course, the West is more diversified than that. It really drives me crazy that we never talk about how diversified the West is. We always talk about it as the politics of oil. But how does the left in Western Canada, or even Ontario, recognize that much of the anxiety-ridden voters over economic uncertainty in this election went to the Conservatives, not to the left? And that suggests there's a material disconnect between workers identifying with the real material dependence on the profits of fossil fuel production. And the right, I think, panders to this vote easier. It's simple, and frankly, it's unproven, but the logic is that when oil companies get rich, workers will get rich. And that's a simple message, and they never have to explain it. It's just assumed and expected. So unless the left can build a real alternative to dependence on fossil fuel production, I think we can all agree, or hopefully we can all agree, that at some point we do have to move away from fossil fuel production if we believe that climate change is as real and devastating as it's going to be, or is already. That the left has to move beyond just hollow arguments of just transition. It has to be a material reality to what that actually looks like. It has to be grounded in the material reality. So as one example, when GM announced its closure in Oshawa of the plant that was making electric cars, why wasn't the left at the forefront saying we should nationalize that industry and make electric cars for Canada Post or for other public infrastructure, or that we can make electric rail and build an accessible public transit system, or here in Saskatchewan we can make wind turbines instead of steel pipe for oil. So on the Sing campaign itself, one of the things I haven't heard much talked about is that the high of 2011 that Jack Layton was able to win in some ways was really interesting, but it also, I think, has to have something to do with the fact that the party was financially very stable in 2011, and it was tied to the per vote subsidy that the Harper government eliminated after the 2011 majority. And suddenly the NDP has no money anymore, and I wonder if there's been a correlation between those two connections. But so the party's broke, and I think what Singh did successfully is stop the bleeding that they were seeing in the polls. So Singh, I think, ran a very positive campaign. I agree with my co-panelist. The flagship policy of pharmacare certainly reflected a so-called turn to the left, and it was a turn to the left at a radical break from what the NDP had become under Layton. But this isn't to say the NDP wasn't left-wing enough, but rather to say that the party seeks to moderate. As it does that, it moves more and more closer to liberal reformism, and it's always difficult to navigate that politics for the NDP. Singh's campaign was entirely leader-driven, it was personality-driven, and seemingly more about style than substance, although I will say that when you look at their caucus, it has to be one of the most diverse caucuses in the history of Canada right now. Like, for instance, some of the candidates he's able to attract, the Northern Indigenous candidate from Nunavut, I think these are sort of real breakthroughs. And he performed well, even beyond exception, and stopped the bleeding. But he also managed to save off the Greens. And just to hear the numbers, and I'm going to end here. In 2015, they won 3,470,000 votes. In 2019, they won 2,849,000 votes. They lost almost 620,000 votes between these two elections. So to call it a victory is really problematic. The Quebec breakthrough of 2011 is gone. Many of those losses are from Quebec. And the Greens, by contrast, actually gained almost 600,000 votes, but only 2 seats. So I think the NDP and the left politics in general are really suffering between these very big extremes in terms of regional political economies and being squeezed by the Greens and the Liberals. And I think this is a real tough moment for the NDP. And maybe it's positive for the future, but I don't see now how the NDP is going to move in this direction without really tackling some of these issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Charles. And finally, Kevin.
Thank you, Ken, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I was just invited recently, and we were on the call yesterday to talk about what each of us is going to speak to. And Ken said, well, you can be the Conservative on the panel, Kevin. You can speak to what the Premier's thinking about here in the province of Saskatchewan. And I assure you I have no inside knowledge. The Premier didn't call me up and say, here's my response to the federal election, Kevin. What do you think? But I'm going to take a bit of a different perspective on this as to that this federal election was a macrocosm of what's been happening in the country over the last 3 years. And if you think about this, over the last 3 years, the citizenry of this country has not been happy with their governments, for the most part. We start with Christy Clark in BC on the West Coast 2 years ago. Won the most seats, but didn't enjoy the confidence of the legislature, so now there's a coalition government between the NDP and the Greens there. Premier Notley next door, one-term premier, shown the door after one term. Premier Selinger in Manitoba 3 years ago. Now, some of this is a function of length of time in office and tenure and the baggage that goes that's associated with length in office. But Premier Selinger defeated. Premier Pallister, 3 years into his mandate, calls another general election just recently, wins a reduced, still has a majority, but a reduced majority. Premier Wynne in Ontario, a Liberal government, under a federal Liberal government, shown the door. Premier Couillard in Quebec, a one-term premier. 3 consecutive surplus budgets in that province. Because I've talked to the finance minister when I was at the Fed-Prov territorial meetings. Always bragged about, I've got a surplus budget, Doherty, how are you doing in Saskatchewan? And we would laugh about that around the table and then ask him how much equalization he received in that budget, but along with some of the other ministers. But a one-term premier, Premier Couillard, shown the door. Premier McLaughlin in PEI, a Liberal premier, shown the door. Coalition government in Prince Edward Island. Bryant Gallant in New Brunswick, a one-term premier, Liberal premier, shown the door. So what we're seeing here, and then you look at the federal election on Monday night. Prime Minister Trudeau, after the 2015 election, enjoyed a 184-seat majority government, now reduced to 157-seat minority government. So it says to me that the citizens are saying to their governments, you're not listening to us. Here's our concerns, and you're going down a path that we don't agree with, or you're spending money on things that we don't agree with, or you're not taking our issues seriously. I say all that because now you listen to Premier Kenney from Alberta, well, all the different premiers. I heard Premier Ford speaking yesterday, or Premier Kenney, Premier Moe. So Premier Moe comes out, and I heard some criticisms from some of the panelists saying they thought his tone was over the top and perhaps even contributing to the divisiveness in the country. He says he's a frustrated federalist. Now think about this. I don't remember any talk or conversation during this campaign, I'm not here to relitigate the campaign, about agriculture. Premier Moe comes from a rural constituency, Shelbrook. I'm sure he's got farmers up there saying to him, my bins are full of last year's canola. I can't move it. My crop is going to hell in a handbasket this year because of the weather, nobody's fault, but when I do get the crop off, I've got no place to put it because I can't sell it to China because it's been shut down. And nobody's talking about it. So these are the concerns he's hearing from his caucus members and from his constituents. That's just one example. He just returned from a trade mission, as we all know. I have not talked to him since then, but I'm sure he heard different stories in that trade mission with the various company representatives that were along with him on their frustrations in trying to access international markets, be it China or India or other places, into the US. So I think perhaps his tone was over the top, but I think his frustration is real with respect to what the citizens of this province are told the federal government, told Mr. Trudeau, and are telling him and his caucus members a year out from their provincial election. So tone you could argue with. If I had been advising the Premier, I would have said, Premier, it's the day after the election. You don't need to issue a letter. Maybe you do because you want that for the public consumption. You want that to send a message to the citizens of the province. But I would have picked up the phone to the Prime Minister and said, Prime Minister, I'm coming to see you. We got a problem. Or if I was advising the Prime Minister, I would have said, jump on the government jet and fly out and get Kenney and Moe in a room and say, you know what? We need to figure this out. I have no MPs in the provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta. So forget about a cabinet post. I don't even have anybody in the caucus to represent the interests of those citizens in those two provinces and other wide swaths of Western Canada where there's no representation there. I suspect they're making overtures to the newly elected MP in Alberta already to say, why don't you cross the floor? I've got a cabinet spot for you just to get a cabinet minister in Alberta. I have no idea. McPherson, I think, is her name. I don't even know what her background is, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're not making overtures to her already. I'll wrap up here, Ken. I talked to a very prominent Liberal in the province yesterday morning on the, obviously the morning after. very concerned. Goes back to the 72 Trudeau won and the situation he was faced with in Western Canada. And Prime Minister Trudeau, current Prime Minister Trudeau, has depoliticized the Senate, so to speak. He's taken the Liberal senators out of the Liberal caucus. So you can't even pluck an individual from the province. I mean, you could walk it back, Jim, I heard you say that, and appoint that individual to the Senate and have that person sit at the cabinet table to at least have some representation at the cabinet table to talk about what's going on the ground here in the province. But I think these leaders across the country now have to reach out to each other and say, look, where do we have points of agreement? What are your must-haves, Prime Minister? And here's our must-haves. And where do we disagree? And where are the points of intersectionality of all those three different things? Let's start from that basis and see where we can work together. I don't know if it's going to happen or not.
Excellent. Okay, those are the opening remarks. We'll get into a bit more issue-specific. There's some specific issues that need to be discussed, and also some issues, then some policy issues. Then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. I know that I'm sure John Conway in Saskatoon is dying to get in on this as well. So we'll allow the audience members to participate a bit. But I know that one issue that we talked about discussing was the issue of populism and the People's Party. And I know Lolene wanted to talk a little bit about the performance of the People's Party and what this means and how this might affect the Conservative Party going ahead and so on. So Lolene? And then the other panelists, feel free. It's sort of now the free-for-all part of the panel where people can feel free to jump in whenever they're prepared.
Great. So this will be like the free-for-all at the debate, so we can just go wherever we want.
Yes.
Talk over each other.
Talk over each other.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so everybody turn on your mics. So actually, just before I talk about the PPC, I just want to comment on something that Kevin said, because I completely agree that that the leaders need to talk, and they need to talk to each other as human beings, not through media and not through press releases. And what I think Canadians are wanting is they're wanting their leaders to find ways forward rather than to score points. And so I couldn't agree more, Kevin, that they need to find their points of agreement. And I hope that sentiment is something that we see emerge in the days and weeks to come. So the People's Party of Canada, yeah. So the PPC is fascinating to me. Not in a, yeah, just leave it at that. But one thing I think was very interesting about the PPC was, first of all, the extent to which the media and the Canadian pundits and all the people decided to treat them as a legitimate force in Canada from the get-go. And I found that astonishing. I can say that when I was watching the leaders debate, the English leaders debate that all of them participated in, just the very fact that Bernier was on that stage was causing my blood pressure to go up. I think that's there's sort of a larger question that we need to think about in future elections of who should be speaking to the Canadian public, and given that kind of audience, and who should not. But beside that, and to go back to Jim's points about the future of the Conservative Party, so we don't know what's going to happen with the PPC. Some of us might have hopes of what will happen, but they could continue to be a bit of a force. But let's assume that with Bernier gone, let's assume that Bernier decides there's something else he'd like to do with his life, and he moves on to something else, and perhaps this party ceases to have strong leadership. Well, where does that element in the Canadian population go? Because they were voicing what appealed to at least, what was it, 1.6 or roughly 2% of the Canadian population, and you know, those people, are they just going to go back to the Conservative Party, or are we potentially going to see, some other splinter movements coming up? They definitely pushed what was considered acceptable political discourse in Canada, to my mind. They definitely challenged our understandings of our Canadian identity in terms of our beliefs of ourselves as this caring, sharing, multicultural society. And, perhaps that genie was coming out of the bottle anyway. But I think that there's been some interesting developments because of them. And, sometimes things are better when they're out in the open. And at the same time, just because their leader lost and they performed abysmally and all of that doesn't mean that political movement, that political sentiment is gone. I mean, it's 2 days later. It's not gone. So
Just 2 quick points from me that build on Loline's point. Number one, I would say that Maxime Bernier picked up the Preston Manning castaways. If you recall, when Preston Manning formed the Reform Party, it was a coalition of a lot of people that were very extreme ends of the spectrum, and there was a lot of criticism for that. And eventually, I think that as the Alliance and eventually the Conservative Party, they were able to sort of distance themselves somewhat from that particular group. He's picked it up. So that's point number one, and speaks to Loline's point that it's there, and it's been there for quite a while, is my additional point. The second one is I think that, what we have here is a convergence of Canadian narrative, Canadian populism with American populism and European right-wing populism. And I'm personally interested in writing a paper. I'm writing it as I speak, and that is on the convergence that's occurring in the area of immigration with respect to what came out of this election, the narrative that came out of this election, and the narrative that we've heard in United States and Europe. I think there's a convergence, and my big concern, especially because it touches on multiculturalism, is whether the seeds are being planted for something more substantial and profound, and I worry for my country today.
Hey, Sally here. I'm going to jump in. You guys, I think I'm getting feedback from you guys there in Saskatoon. I want to jump in on this one because I worked the Alberta election in the war room, and we had a kind of analogous scenario with Derek Fildebrandt and the Freedom Party of Alberta, and it kind of even the formation of that party was similar in that he was a Wild Roser, then UCP member, and summarily dismissed and formed his own party. And frankly, the man was a constant new disappointment to me over the course of the campaign as a New Democrat. They just, in terms of how we were kind of hoping that they would siphon away some of that vote from the UCP, and they didn't. He was lazy, and they didn't get very good candidates, and all over the place. I completely agree that there's no way that Maxime Bernier should have been allowed on that debate stage. I know Jagmeet Singh argued strenuously against it. The Liberals didn't, because they had the same hopes that I had over the course of the Alberta campaign. They wanted to have that right flank attack on Andrew Scheer. It's frustrating, but politics being the kind of blood sport that it is, people have these different motivations for having that split on the right. Just as you see, it can be damaging to have, splits on the left, and it's the same thing. That's why you saw the Unite the Conservative movement in Alberta. You saw it with the Reform Party and the Progressive Conservatives before that. You ask where they go from here, and I think the answer is online. And that's we're in that different scenario than even when the Reform and the Progressive Conservatives joined, is that even without that kind of political party, they have this venue for a movement, very powerful venue of a movement online. So whether the rise of the PPC or the complete lack thereof means that it's not a problem, I don't think so. I think you have to be really vigilant in the case of a growing movement online.
Kevin, and then Jim?
Yeah, Mr. Bernier, I think was probably the last we've heard of him, and another fringe party that will reared its ugly head, if you will, and probably never to be heard of again in some other iteration with some of those folks, perhaps. I would rather talk about a process issue in this campaign or this election period that I think contributed to the regionalism that we saw and we continue to see. And that was the fact that one could argue, why was Mr. Blanchette on at the leaders' debate on the national stage with the leader of a party that can't possibly form a government and represents one province? So one could equally make the argument as to why was Mr. Blanchette. All three debates that Mr. Trudeau showed up at, 2 French and 1 English, were all held in Quebec. Ms. May and Mr. Bernier were not allowed in the TVA debate in Quebec, even though they were running candidates across the entire country and met all the requirements for a national party. Mr. Blanchette was allowed on the debate stage on the major network televised debates, both again held in Quebec, just across the river. I understand that in Gatineau, Quebec, but all three held in Quebec. So what does that say about regionalism with respect to why would we not demand of our leaders to have more than 3 debates? I know they have to agree to this, but it should be part and parcel of what you have to do if you want to be the prime minister of this country, is show up at least 5 debates in every region of the country. They started these debates at 7 o'clock Eastern time, which is 4 o'clock Vancouver, so people aren't even home from work yet, let alone have the opportunity to sit and listen to who's applying for job of prime minister. So why are people in Prince George, BC not as worthy of having their leaders show up and debate in that community or in Sackville, Nova Scotia, versus just in the province of Quebec? And I'm not trying to be picking on Quebec here, but there's a problem there with respect to how we demand our leaders are accountable to the citizens that they want to represent.
So Pauline and I have been agreeing a lot lately, and that's really not entertaining. So I'm going to disagree with her on this one. I think the problem with the debates is there's 6 people on stage, and that's just too many. But there's a broader problem of who's allowed to have platforms and speak politically. And I think there's a couple of things we need to realize. One is the nice people that get invited to post-election panels at policy schools don't control it anymore because everybody's gone online. The second is that Canada's been pretty exempt from a shift across the Western world that's seen people trust the political process less and less. And I don't think we do that process any favors by saying, you're in and you're out. And I'm agnostic about where we draw that line, but to say the People's Party on the one hand has said things that we don't like, but gets 2% of the vote. Would we have done that with the Greens in 2000? I know we did with the debates, but in terms of how we cover them and talk about them, I can't come up with rules to do that. And the third thing, and I think this is the difference with Reform and whatever the movement is now, Reform had a set of changes they wanted to see to the democratic process. There was substance there designed or intended to make ordinary people more engaged. Whether they were good or bad changes to the process doesn't particularly matter. What we're seeing today is simply a desire to opt out of the process entirely. And I think that's actually the dangerous bit, is people just opting out and a specific community opting out. I don't think we should reinforce that by pushing them out, by saying, no, you don't belong. These views are not to be allowed from out of the rocks or the basement. So,
Thanks. Charles, did you want to add?
I just have 3 quick things. 1 is the Bloc, 2 is the Liberals, and 3 is whether we'll ever see the rise of or questions of voting reform come back. So on the Bloc, well, one of the reasons I think their voice is important, both in English and French, is because there's Francophone and Anglophones live in Quebec who want to hear what the Bloc has to say, because they have they won 32 seats. They won 32.5% in the 2nd largest populous province in the country. So we need to hear that voice. It's not so much that you have a question of whether they can form government, but they're a legitimate political voice, certainly in Quebec. And it's interesting to see how much of that campaign, and my French is okay, But what's interesting about that campaign is they didn't ever talk about sovereignty in Quebec. The Bloc talked about nationalism. And what's interesting about that is the nationalism is taking on a particularly right-wing drift within Quebec, right? Obviously, Bill 21 was the sort of the linchpin of that new nationalism, which is highly tied towards racialized minorities within Quebec. And that's not to say that Quebec is more racist than other places. I don't think it is. In fact, it's not. But it's taking on a very bizarre nationalist turn, which I think ties into some of your questions or your points earlier. The other part is the Liberals. I don't have the answer to this, but I'm really curious about how fast the shine came off of Justin Trudeau. Not from 2015, because there was this extended honeymoon for so long after his election. So really from like 2017 and 2018, suddenly Trudeau went from being a global personality to basically being a disgrace at the national level, international level. And in the campaign with the blackface and brownface images and the other things, that the Trudeau formula fell apart. And yet, interestingly, that didn't lead to a defeat at the national level. And then finally, I'm just curious, more of an open-ended question to the audience, if given the electoral results, the way it's skewed regionally, and I'm curious if the question of voting reform comes back, given how small shifts have led to huge transitions in seats at the national level. I mean, for instance, in Ontario, the NDP in 2015 won 16.5% with 8 seats. This time won 16.8 with 6. So almost no change in their vote. They're losing seats. And you can see that at every party and every level. I just happen to have those numbers in front of me. So it's interesting. I wonder if that will come back. So those are my three points. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Charles. That's very good. That was a good round. And we did have one other set of issues I wanted to talk before we open it up to questions. And this. So we're a school of public policy, and there's lots of students of public policy in the classroom. And so there's a few policy issues, and I think everybody here who's interested in public policy was somewhat disappointed. I should say, probably putting it mildly, that there wasn't much discussion of public policy, but particularly things like agriculture, Kevin mentioned, Indigenous issues, the deficit and debt issue seems to be absent. There was a lot of immigration issues weren't there. Climate change was maybe there, but in a kind of a muted fashion to some extent, and the policies certainly weren't anything to really get people excited when they offered policies on those issues. So I wonder if there's any particular issues that panel members felt were not covered, that the debate was inadequate. Sally, you've leaped to the phone.
I have, and normally as a comms person, I don't get involved in policy discussions very much, so I'll give you the communications perspective on it. I think every party did talk a lot of policy. They were making announcements every single day. From the NDP on pharmacare, housing, talking about Green New Deal, the Liberals in tax cuts, the Conservatives in tax cuts. There was lots of policy announcements, lots of press releases with lots of details over the entire course of the campaign. But we look at what the media chooses to cover, and frankly, the media chooses to cover it because we choose to read it. We choose to click on those links. So you always get into that kind of chicken or the egg scenario. And the other thing I'll say is that, I don't know, this is the 4th general election I've worked now, and every single election we say there was not enough discussion about policy. I tend to think we sometimes have kind of rose-tinted glasses about, in the past, absolutely every election was nothing about, really proper debate and policy analysis, when I don't think they really ever were.
Great, thanks. In Saskatoon? Anybody in Saskatoon want to?
Just very quickly, in terms of whether there were policy discussions or not, there was a lot of policy discussed or mentioned. It wasn't discussed in a substantive and substantial way. And number 2, ultimately, we didn't get a few issues that we could focus on. There was so much that even a policy wonk like me just cannot remember everything that was thrown about. And I call this the smorgasbord election, policy election, or the Oprah Winfield, where basically they tried to appeal and appease to every single group or of the electorate, indeed almost every individual. And like Oprah, they said, and there's a car for you, and there's a car for you, and there's this for you. And so there was just, it wasn't a discussion about the merits. It was more of trying to outbid each other in policy expenditures rather than really discussing policy substance per se.
And I'll just add to that, in addition to outbidding, there was my opinion, a complete disregard for federalism and what provinces do, what the federal government does, what municipalities do, and I'll point particularly to the NDP on that front. But generally, there was sort of an expansive, we'll talk about everything and see what lands.
And also, and this will be quick because I know Jim is reaching for the mic, and I never want to cut off Jim. But I mean, there was a lot of this. I mean, often elections will polarize around a couple issues, and that does happen, and I agree with Sally. But one of the polarizing issues, of course, was the pipeline debate, and yet every time it was talked about, there was no discussion about how it impacts First Peoples and Indigenous lands and reconciliation. And I just thought that was a giant hole that you could drive a Mack truck through. No, obviously, hopefully it's not with conventional burning gasoline, but it was just like, it was right there, and it's like, and there's no discussion. So how are you going to build it, Mr. Scheer? No discussion of Indigenous people's lands and reconciliation and the right to refusal. And I thought that was a glaring hole in the campaign and the big issue that defined the campaign, which was climate change and pipelines.
Thanks. Jim?
So I'll make a really quick point, but basically to agree with Sally, I think one of the reasons that it seems light on policy is policy in terms of the types of things that policy schools do. Let's get a bunch of data and run it and see what the best answer is. But in terms of the vision of where to go, it was the broadest and I think most robust differences between the parties that I have in my memory, right? The difference between what Scheer had on offer and what the NDP or the Greens had on offer is big, right? And so you're not going to do the detailed cost-benefit analysis, but they're very different visions articulated. I tend to think that's kind of healthy.
Well, I can't help but notice the contrast between this election and the last one, where one of the issues, and I'll ask this to Kevin, was really about the defining feature in some senses was about the fiscal positions, the affordability of the platforms that the governments were offering. And of course, the NDP famously said, no budget deficit, budget surplus, and all this. But this election, there was apparently no interest in talking about Canada's finances by everybody. It was, as Joe said, the Oprah election, promises rained down upon the electorate, big spending promises, everybody offering boutique tax cuts. What caused this lack of interest in, I suppose, and I'd ask this from the point of view of the conservative, like, fiscal conservatism, that kind of sense that we really need to get this under order. But all parties, too, seem to be absent.
Excuse me. I would love to be a finance minister in that environment because you can run deficit after deficit and it doesn't seem like the public cares. I think the public does care. But it's the age-old argument that you have with inside of a caucus, and I think Mr. Trudeau defined it in 2015 when he did outflank Mr. Mulcair on, we're going to run deficits because we're going to invest in infrastructure and invest in people and all those lines that you think, okay, well, we're going to benefit from this, and Mr. Mulcair was more concerned about balancing the budget. I am concerned about the fact, and I was as finance minister, and mindful of when your debt levels start, and if you have a plan, and I'll pick on Mr. Trudeau here for a second, not to be partisan, but I just recall his promises totaled, I think, about $92 billion over the next 4 years. Deficits, confirmed deficits, built upon not only his budget figures of Mr. Morneau's last budget, but then he added to it during the campaign. Scheer said he would balance the budget within 5 years, but didn't say how. So at some point in time, because the Liberals kept using this, well, as a percentage of our GDP, the debt isn't as bad because you'll note it's a percentage of GDP and it's not going up relative to the size of the economy. But it's incompatible with respect to what's driving the GDP in the economy. And if what's driving for the most part, what's driving the GDP in the economy are primary resource industries that you're planning on shutting down or at least eliminating over time, and you can't demonstrate you're going to replace that contribution to the country's GDP with something else, and nobody has defined that in the major political parties, then your debt levels do start taking on much greater meaning with respect to your fiscal stability of the country. That holds true for every provincial jurisdiction too. I heard you say Premier Romano's in the audience. He knows that full well. So, but I remember as finance minister, just quick story, doing an editorial board on one of my budgets when the editorial board for the newspaper in the province said, I said, nobody wants their taxes raised, nobody wants their services cut, and they abhor deficit spending. They don't like debt. Those three are incompatible. And the editorial board chairperson looked at me and said, but that's your problem. You're the finance minister. So when you're trying to explain this to the citizens, it's a hell of a lot easier in those scrums every morning with the comms folks to deliver on a tax, a boutique tax cut or some type of assistance in a spending program than it is to explain your net debt as a percentage of GDP and what that track looks like, and you start to lose people because 30 billion becomes 40 billion or 20 billion. They just don't differentiate any further. So I think you're absolutely right. The media ignore it because a lot of them don't understand it and it's not good copy. It's not good discussion. It's not good for the pundits to sit around and talk about. But it is critically important to your pocketbook and to the business confidence in this country with respect to investment coming into this country or leaving this country.
Thanks. Okay, we have some, we've sort of given this time for some questions, and as people get their questions ready, maybe I'll just ask one more, or I don't know if Marie's got anybody lined up. If not, I will ask.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll ask one last question, but get prepared to ask some questions. And this one is just about, one of the things is the status of the party leaders after this election, and if people have some comments, and I'm just wondering particularly what's in store for Mr. Scheer. I think there's, and the Conservative Party to some extent. Is it, we talked about this a little before the panel started, and is it going to become a regional party like it was at one point, and is this, and does he stay on as leader? I think if anybody the questions will be around his leadership, I suppose. They should be around most party leaders other than Blanchette, but I think the discussion will probably be around Mr. Scheer, rightly or wrongly. And I don't know if people want to if that's a fair assessment.
I'm going to take this one because I'm talking about this exact subject on CBC in about 55 minutes, so I'll get some practice in. I think if I was on Team Trudeau, I would be saying, how did you manage to go down and get a minority when you're up against this guy? And if I was on, the Conservative side, I would be saying you had SNC-Lavalin, you had blackface, you had the India trip, you had all of these things, and how did you manage to mess it up and not win it? I think both of those, unlike the NDP, who is kind of used to losing, they don't like to. And so I think on both those sides and those, the party mucky mucks and whatnot, we'll be having those discussions. I think with Jagmeet Singh and talking to people in the party, in the past 48 hours, despite losing those seats in Quebec. I think any success we had, and even myself about 2 months ago, I honestly thought we were getting stomped down to about 10 seats. So I think any of that kind of saving graces that we had over the course of the campaign was really down to him and his own personal popularity. So I think it'd be very difficult to try and bounce him now. And also, I personally cannot deal with another leadership race.
Anybody else, Saskatoon?
Yeah, we have one here.
Okay, questions are now coming in.
Yeah, my question is about the foreign policy issues that were ignored during the election. I don't think China could be more delighted as it wages full-on economic war against its nemesis of Western democracies. It couldn't be more delighted to see our democratic process hijacked by issues such as blackface that consumed over half of the distractions in the campaign. And when will these questions be addressed by leaders that will have to come together at some point to respond to this combativeness of China?
Okay, great. Yeah, one of the other issues that was more or less absent in the election is foreign policy. Yeah, Kevin.
Well, China is just one country that, you know, international trade relationship with, India, the US. That's a very complicated field, and I think I would harken back to Prime Minister Chrétien's days and bring the premiers together to talk about those issues. Those provinces that are reliant upon trade, such as Saskatchewan, those are critically important issues for the citizens of those respective jurisdictions. And I think that pretty much covers the entire country. And if I were Prime Minister Trudeau, I would either bilaterally or bring them together to say, look, we've got enough problems inside the country just trading amongst ourselves. But these international trade agreements, these international markets for our products are critically important to the viability of our country from an economic perspective. We need to come together and see, again, how do we work together on these issues? And, you know, I give Prime Minister Trudeau full credit. When I was finance minister and Mr. Morneau, when Mr. Trump was elected president, he was talking about that cross-border tax issue. The effort of Prime Minister Trudeau and his senior ministers to fan out to decision makers in the US, to build those relationships, to talk about the impact on those respective states that have good trading relationships with Canada, I gave him full credit. I think former Premier Wall gave him full credit for what they were doing there. I remember Morneau calling me and telling me, giving me updates, as he did with all finance ministers, as to what was going on with the relationship with the US, and that type of communication is critically important. I think that they need to do more of that now on the big issues, not just China.
Yeah, Team Canada is going to get back, get the plane together, and yeah, it's going to happen. That's actually not a bad suggestion. That kind of an approach.
So,
Can I?
Oh,
sorry, can I jump in here, Ken?
Oh, sure. Yes. By all means.
Jumping in over Jim, I agree with the idea of the need for some type of Team Canada. And to go to the larger point of other countries potentially being happy to have us squabbling about internal stuff, you're absolutely right. And the more we're squabbling about this and that and the different parts fighting with each other, the more we are distracted from looking at needing to improve and protect our trade relationships, and the more we're distracted from Canada's place in the world. And I would see a role absolutely for the Prime Minister to try to pull people together. I think there's also a potential for premiers to take a very strong role in this and try to work together. We have the Council of the Federation, where they can have that venue, and they can also try to work federally, provincially, territorially. A number of years ago, we had Premier Gordon Campbell from BC, and his nickname was Captain Canada because he was so focused on trying to get the different parts of the country working together. Right now, I think we are less than the sum of our parts. And someone needs to step up and have some leadership to at least have us add up to our parts, and ideally to be more than just that.
Excellent. Jim, do you have a...
So yeah, I agree with all the trade stuff and that it wasn't talked a lot about, and it's important. I think in terms of the campaign itself, we got quite lucky. There'd been a lot of talk over the summer of kind of people concerned about foreign interference in the process of the election, and the feds had kind of cobbled together this committee of deputy ministers to decide whether or not that occurred. My nightmare scenario would have been that committee in a closer contest coming in and saying, listen, in a Brampton riding or in a Vancouver riding, we do find evidence of significant foreign interference a couple of days before the election happened. That would have really damaged our process, I think. And the kind of riff off of that I think we need to think about in terms of how we talk about and cover elections, and I'm unfortunately not the person to help with this, is we need to get used to the idea that Canadian elections are now multilingual, that they're occurring in Punjabi and Mandarin as well as French and English. And I know both the CPSA and I think also the media don't grapple with that reality enough at all.
Thanks, everyone. Do you have any other questions? Questions? Oh, here. Okay, question in Regina, then one in Saskatoon.
Alamil, MPA student here in Johnson Shayama. This was my first federal elections as a voter here, and I'm not as knowledgeable in the politics, so my question will be about the elections themselves. Do you think that the electoral system is fully responsive to the democratic values of this country. And in light of these elections, do you think we as a country need an electoral reform?
I think we've talked a lot today about kind of the regionalization, the seemingly fractured nature of Canada. And I think we do have to look about how our electoral system produces that. This was supposed to be the last first past the posts, or last election was supposed to have been the last first past the posts election, but it wasn't. And now we have a situation where the governing party has the lowest percentage of popular vote, 33% in the history of Canada, I think, and where you have completely blue provinces, with the one tiny exception, like I said, in Edmonton, despite there being a significant percentage of popular vote that did not go Conservative. I think when you look at that map, that's all kind of blue, red, light blue for Bloc, with one great big orange up in there, Nunavut at least, to kind of show our colors. I think that looks very different. We look very less divided if we have a mixed proportional representation.
Yeah, it is a perennial question after elections, is do we need electoral reform? And it seemed to be very muted this time, that certainly nobody was advancing it. It was part of the Liberal platform the previous election, but none of the other parties seemed to be enthusiastic about electoral reform. And I'm just wondering, have we seen the end of electoral reform in Canada? Is it kind of completely a dead issue now? And is that a good thing?
Well, first of all, let me say what a great panel this has been. I've really learned so much and got great participants, two of whom were former students of mine, Laline and Jim. Let me just make a quick comment about Kevin Doherty's point about agriculture. I watched the French debate, and that's a debate in which agriculture figured prominently, about the marketing board for milk. I mean, that was clear. In the English debate, not a word. The word never crossed anyone's mind. And this is, I think, to reinforce the point that Kevin made, this is a critical issue of the debates. I'm going to argue against, I won't get into the argument, but a point that I would make, I think we have to rethink about who's in and who's out. And I would suggest that maybe the best thing that happened this time was that Bernier was actually in the debate. And he ended up with 2% of the vote, no candidates elected, including himself. And otherwise, he would have been able to say, I'm a victim of the system. I'm outside looking in. You guys are all debating, and you want to keep me out. I can imagine he would have had more than 2% of the vote. I'd like to ask a question of Jim. I don't know where the camera is. I guess it's over there. Jim, you singled out Tom Flanagan's Waiting for the Wave book, and I think there's a lot to be said for that book. Is there any likelihood of change that will come to the Conservative Party while there are still very strong remnants of the old Reform Alliance in there? Or do we have to wait for yet another generation for the party to move away from its more kind of fixed base of support to broaden its base to what I would call maybe the more progressive conservative base?
It's a really good question, John. I don't have an answer, in part because it's been 10 years since I was on the ground seriously with conservative activists. I would note, though, that some of that generational change has happened, right? So I think part of Scheer's style is that he wasn't part of that generation that cut their teeth in the Reform Party. He's a half generation younger than that, and he's much more a member of the establishment, right? He was the former speaker. So I'm not sure. I do think, to reference another even older book, that Perlin's Tory syndrome still holds true, and we'll see how that rolls out for him. This kind of internal division as the party fights amongst itself in opposition.
A couple. It's great to see Professor Courtney. I was also one of his students at one time. And quick story, I ran for student union politics. I lost by 1 vote at the University of Saskatchewan. I walked into class. Professor Courtney stopped the class and he said, "How did you do, young man?" I said, "I lost, Professor." He says, "You keep trying." So maybe he's why I ended up in the legislature. But one of the things I would point out with respect to the Federal Conservative Party is if you look at a lot of the big names stayed out of the leadership race last time around. And I remember talking to Jason Kenney when he was the immigration minister under Mr. Harper. I saw him at an event here, and we were chatting. And he was telling me that his weekends, when he was in Ottawa, he would fly to Toronto on a Friday night. He would do 10 events in Toronto on Saturday, fly to Montreal and do 10 events on Sunday in Montreal with different ethnic communities, reaching out to new Canadians. And they really tried hard to understand the new Canadians and what their concerns are and reached out to them right across the country. And Jason Kenney was the point guy on that. But you think of their regional personalities, if you will, whether it's a James Moore in BC or a Peter MacKay in Nova Scotia. I try to think of who those individuals are in the Conservative Party now and a Jason Kenney. And I can't think of who they are. So those individuals from a regional perspective could bring those concerns and issues to their caucus table and talk about them and understand what the needs are at the caucus table. If your caucus is comprised completely, for the most part, of Western Canadians now, in the Conservative caucus or in the various parts that the NDP have members, they're down to 1 member in Quebec now, or the Liberal Party now with no representation for the most part on the prairies, then you start to have just those regional discussions at your caucus table because that's all who's being represented there. And so it's critically important for these parties, and I say this, and I'm not a member of the Conservative Party, but I have been in the past, but I would say they have to, the outreach into those areas that they don't have MPs sitting now is critically important to understand the issues in those regional areas.
Just going back to that in answer to the professors about kind of generational change, when I was studying political science with Andrew Scheer at the University of Ottawa, he was actually volunteering for the Reform Party at the time. So, you know, he does come from that, not from the progressive conservative side of the party. I think talking to some conservative friends of mine over the course of the past couple of days is that feeling of, it's not necessarily reformers and it's not progressive conservatism, it's this new breed, I would call it kind of more alt-right, of, you know, Hamish Marshall as his communications director, who's one of the founders of Rebel. And that's where I was talking earlier about the micro-targeting and the digital campaigning and the memes and everything like that. And I know a lot of people, that's where, you know, they were upset saying that just didn't work this time. And I think what you'll probably start to see is some more of Harper's old people come back into kind of the reins of power within the Conservative Party.
Saskatoon?
Ken? Yeah, I've got one here.
Okay. Did you?
Yeah.
Hi, folks. My name is Christina, and I'm a student at the U of S. So I think it's safe to say that political knowledge is somewhat lacking, and with a diversity of issues such as international terrorism, green infrastructure, taxation, that makes sense. Everyone cannot know everything. So I have a two-part question for you. One being, you know, this lacking of knowledge allows for the capitalization on fear and anxiety, driving home certain points at the expense of talking about actual policy. So do you think this is fair in the game of politics? And my second question is, if you could speculate, what do you think is the discrepancy between what Canadians actually want if they were more informed versus what is being realized? Thank you.
Well, just a quick observation, which sort of refers back to my earlier comment. A lot of people don't get engaged in what's become a sport. People like to watch it, but they really don't necessarily understand it. And part of the problem is that there's just too much on the table. There's too much complexity. You need a certain degree of sophistication to understand it. And the politicians sometimes try to simplify it, but I think there's just too much going on. There's too much noise that people aren't even focused. I guess we could use it almost a classroom as an example. If teachers all over the map, at the end of the day, how do you figure out what's essential and what's not? And I think that's what's happening to the electorate. As a result, they don't engage, and many then feel that they shouldn't even turn out to vote.
But the question of the appeal to the emotions, I suppose, eh? Charles, were you going to?
Yeah, just a couple. First off, thanks for the questions. Christina's in my first year class, and she's really proud of that question, so it's great. Just 3 questions, or 3 points that I want to quickly make. So one on the trade and the economy. One of the things that's really interesting is that, despite all the dire economic debate, is that the Canadian economy for the last 3 years has been humming at full, like almost full employment, which is really unheard of since the 1970s. So it's interesting that we're paralleling these two. Is always caveated, well, there might be storm clouds on the horizon. That's not to defend the Trudeau economy, because I think on the abstract, there's actually a lot of really bad things happening on the bottom where we're seeing the rise of precarious work. And that's the one thing about trading the economy in elections that always gets lost is we need markets for our goods, but we never talk about what's happening on the ground with workers and how they're struggling to pay the rent. And I think that was the hope of the Conservative campaign, which was around affordability. Of course, their answers was to cut taxes, which of course disproportionately affects wealth inequality. And that was one thing that was completely absent, I think, from this campaign, is how unequal we've become over the last decade under both Harper and Mr. Trudeau. That was absent, and the NDP talked a little bit about it, but not really. They talked, well, we'll make life more affordable by giving you Pharmacare, which is a great policy, but it doesn't actually address the reason why people are poor. And I think that sort of inequality was absent. Mr. Doherty talked about how there's this disconnect between voter apathy and anger. And that's why I'm actually, full disclosure, I've been an activist for voting reform since as long as I've been able to understand politics. I've always thought our system is broken. I know we don't all agree on that. But having said that, in the middle of this campaign, one of the largest mobilizations in Canadian history happened, where thousands of people in the streets of Montreal and Toronto were striking over climate, young people. And I'd be really curious to know how many of those people engaged at the polls. Because for a lot of people, there's just a disconnect between what people are wanting and what they're seeing at the electoral level. And I just think that the reason this question keeps coming back is because there's such a disconnect between what people are interpreting election results and what people are trying to say with their votes. Right? So yeah, 2/3 of people in Saskatchewan voted Conservative, and they're really angry, but 1/3 didn't, and those are now voiceless voters. Right? They will not be heard of during the next 4 years or 3 years, however long this campaign lasts. So I just think, and that plays into this idea that, well, what's the point? The apathy is, what's the point of me voting when in Saskatchewan if I'm going to vote anything but Conservative? Right? And I think that sort of anger and fear is going to continue to resonate whether we like it or not.
Okay, we'll let
so I think that's going to keep coming back.
Good, thanks, Charles. That's great. We're going to let Jim respond to this. Then we're going to have a wrap up. Everybody will get some last comments. And we have to get Sally out. Vashi Capellos is waiting to interview her, so we've got to get her off.
I think it's a really good question about campaigns. I would note that we seem to have bumped up in terms of turnout from where we were a decade ago, which is good. I think we've had emotions in politics forever. We've gotten more sophisticated and have new tools to target them, but that baseline hasn't changed. What I find, and we know that people learn through campaigns, maybe not as much as we'd like. I'm not sure that the problem is learning or information, which is bad for somebody in my business to say. I think it's about choices and trade-offs. And again, I don't think this is a new thing, but we don't like politicians who acknowledge limits. And you could pick on Mr. Prentice in Alberta or Mr. Romano's 95 budget. That is not a popular thing for a politician to say, I can only do so much within a fiscal budget or a carbon budget, or I can only introduce so much change so quickly. That's the part that bothers me about how we talk during campaigns. And I think maybe the micro-targeting has made it slightly worse, but I think that's just a perennial democratic problem.
Okay, well, it's getting close to 3 o'clock, and I just wanted to give all of our panelists, we'll start in the reverse order this time with Kevin, just to offer some concluding remarks about the lessons of the 2019 federal election campaign and what you might speculate about the future as a result of this election and this parliament.
I have no idea. The lessons, I think, we're still digesting what took place here just a couple of days ago. It'll be interesting to see moving forward how this Prime Minister, if he changes at all with respect to his approach to the provinces and his relationship with the provinces. I can tell you, having sat at the federal, provincial, territorial table, is that they were very intrusive into provincial jurisdictions. At the Canada Health Social Transfer, I remember Jane Philpott sitting there as the Minister of Health saying, we're going to share this money with you, but you're going to spend it the way we want you to spend it. And provinces going, no, healthcare is our responsibility. We're closer to the people. And so that's just one example. So I'll be interested to see if this new iteration of the federal Liberal government changes their approach to dealing with provincial relations on a variety of fronts. Equally, these premiers, the Prime Minister is a duly elected Prime Minister of the country, excuse me, albeit in a minority position, but he's still the duly elected Prime Minister of the country, and these premiers need to find a way to work with him and his party and see what approach they take to it now.
Good. Thanks, Kevin. Charles?
I think the couple things. One is that notwithstanding the divisions, the regional divisions we're seeing, that this isn't really new in Canada. In fact, I think these regional divisions have been with us since the dawn of the state. They just take different iterations over time. That's not to dismiss them as being real, but to suggest that, the sky isn't necessarily falling on Confederation. The debates that we're having with regards to the parties, though, is interesting in that we are seeing party realignments happening at the federal level. Ontario continues to think overwhelmingly be a Liberal province, especially at the federal level. And we haven't talked a lot about cities and city voting. And one of the things that's interesting is how Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, except for some small pockets, have virtually shut out Conservatives, and the debates are around Liberals and to a lesser degree Greens and the NDP, and that's where most people live. So we're having these big debates on regions, but we've kind of ignored the concept of cities, and I think that area, especially at the federal level, is where the federal government is going to target funding. So working with premiers, yeah, of course they have to, but I think you're going to see a lot more intervention in terms of how the federal government relates to mayors and cities, because that area is something that's completely been divorced in this discussion, but that's where most people live, and that's where most of the votes come from. So it's interesting. I'd be interested to see how that plays out over the next couple of years as well. And then, of course, the politics of minority parliaments. Where is it going to fall tomorrow? And the horse race gets transferred onto, but in terms of media coverage, onto the parliament, because in a first past the post system, they're always looking for that one little 3 or 4 points that they can get to get a majority government at 36%, right? And so there'll be a horse race at that point as well, and that'll be something that the media is going to be obsessed with from now until whenever that parliament falls.
Thanks, Charles. Sally.
I think we've pretty much covered. I don't know if I've got anything to add in terms of lesson learned and the election that just occurred. The two things I'm interested in what kind of what develops over the next 4 years or 2 years, but really the next decade or so, is I think a shift from this idea of left and right, which is frankly kind of antiquated language anyways, to more top versus bottom, and the way political parties talk to voters and the way we talk about taxation, and how the kind of youth moves with that as they become voting age and older. And then the next thing, and I'd be interested if anybody is studying or focusing on this, is how increasing use of artificial intelligence and data mining is used going forward, because I frankly think it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better, and data privacy and how that all works into both foreign influence and just general how we communicate with people. In the Internet of Things, you can probably now use what time somebody turns their coffee pot on in the morning to predict what type of voter they are. And there'll be a lot of interesting developments. All political parties right now, left, right, and center, are basically arms race to get that kind of information, and what that means in a larger sense for our democracy here in Canada.
Thanks. My coffee pot comes on at 6:30 in the morning, so just so you know. Joe.
Yeah, very quickly, I'm going to focus on, I think the lessons that should have been learned by the Conservatives in this election. And there are two of them, I think. Number one is that they've got to find a better balance between their policy platform and their profile or their image that Canadians have of them. In terms of policy, I think they've become so narrow centrist that they've ceded a lot of ground to the left. Even though the left is split, they're not getting those votes. So they may be split on the left, but they've lost out on the left in terms of progressive politics. And so they've got to figure out how to broaden that policy base. But secondly, and this is very important, I would ask Conservatives this question. How many of you would have voted for the Liberals if you believed that the Rat Pack represented the Liberals when Sheila Copps and the others were the attack dogs on the front benches for the Liberals? They didn't have a very nice profile. I don't think a lot of Conservatives would have voted for those people. And I think that, unfortunately, the Conservative Party has opted to put attack dogs on the front benches in the opposition benches rather than the people that can engender a certain degree of comfort and confidence and a certain sense of sanity and stability and empathy. And they've got a problem there. And if I were them, I would change the complexion of my front bench in the opposition leading up to the next election. And the tone.
Good. Jim?
Regionalism, yes, but to kind of emphasize Sally's point about how we think of the spectrum, this is the first fall in terms of teaching first-year students where I've realized I am a full generation older than them. The map they have in their head of politics does not match at all the map I've got. And the example I'd use is having young white guys from small towns in Saskatchewan identify their privilege when they introduce you. Like it's really different. And I think the minority parliament and the split left, which we've not really talked that much about, are indicators of that, trying to suss out what this new space looks like.
Good. And finally, last word goes to Lolene.
Thank you. Well, I'll try to keep it short as well. And as I am closing my remarks here, I'd like to thank the audiences at both institutions. It's really great to see this turnout. The question that Ken asked was lessons. Joe spoke to some of the lessons that the Conservatives should have learned. I'll speak to some lessons that the Prime Minister should have learned that I'm not sure yet that he has. And that is that there is need for some humility in Canadian politics. And he does not have a majority. He does not have the shine and the celebrity that he used to have. And he needs to work with his partners in this federation. He needs to work with the provinces. He needs to work with the Indigenous populations in a way that is much more meaningful than simply rhetoric and simply trying to boss people around. And I'm a very strong sort of federalist myself, and I think there needs to be a work for a partnership in this federation. And I believe that the Canadian public, by sending a minority government back, was saying that they are not happy to give carte blanche to any party, and I think that we need some strong leadership in this province in terms of setting a tone of something a bit more meaningful than just retail politics. So I'll leave it at that, Ken.
That's great. Just want to thank all of our panelists. This was really excellent, I have to say. I learned a lot. I don't know if I'm heartened or disheartened about the future of Canada, but there's certainly lots to digest. And so I hope you join me in thanking our panelists for this really excellent presentation.